Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Grahame Grieve. I'm the FHIR product director, which what that means in practice is that whenever you're unhappy with anything that we do, it's my fault. And and everyone is unhappy about versioning. So I thought I'd get that on the table to start with. Okay. So we make multiple releases of FHIR. We are currently working on release 5. I don't know anybody currently using release 1. But there are lots of active communities around release 2, release 3, and release 4 in production. And there are some active communities around some of our transient versions that we do not formally support. And by formally support, that means maintain working code for and consider issuing patches on. I'll get back to patches shortly. So over time, as you all know, we make breaking changes to the specification. Now, in some fantasy land, we wouldn't need to do that. In some fantasy land, we would actually get the specification right first time. But we don't know how that would be. And so we have two other choices. One is that we can make breaking changes, and the other is that we cannot. We could not make breaking changes and just be broken. Or we can make breaking changes and everybody can be unhappy, but only moderately unhappy. And so that's what we do. And if you look at every implementable artifact in the specification, it will carry a maturity rating. And the maturity rating tells you where a resource or a profile or whatever is and going through our process. So when an editor first says, let's have a discussion about a new possible resource, they add it to the specification so we can actually talk about it. So you will see, we try and remove those before we publish a milestone like release 2 or release 3. But if you look at the current build or any of the intermediate builds that are still on the web, you'll see lots of things with a maturity level of zero, which means an editor just put it up to talk about. It may have no life expectancy. But over time, the community argues about things, we try them out, they get more settled, more and more people buy into the consensus. It gets harder and harder to make changes. It gets less and less appropriate or necessary to make changes. So whenever you're working in the specification, you should always check the maturity model, the maturity level of any artifacts as it goes from 1 through to 5, and then after 5, we draw a line in the sand and say, okay, now it's normative, which is standards code word for we won't make breaking changes. At least we won't make breaking changes by some definitions of that. That's a whole other story. And we've actually published some normative content in release 4. In the meantime, all the rest of us in the real world, including me, support multiple versions. So first of all, this is a full release history. It's published at directory.html in the FHIR directory. See our major milestones. In fact, you'll see that I forgot to update this slide because we've now released patches for 3 and 4. So we're at 3.02 and 4.01 now. So when you see a patch version, we do major, minor, and then patch. Major is a FHIR milestone version. So you can see that we've matched them up. And then when we release the second draft, we call it release 1, but then we jump to release 3 so that they match. So 3 dot means it's the version 3 release sequence, which includes the changes we made as we went to release 4. So all the ballot material between 3 and 4 is 3.x, 3.1, 3.2 to 3.3, and they're not supported. Something dot 1 or something not dot 0 means it's not a supported version from HL7's point of view. And then, so 1.0, 3.0, 4.0, they are the versions we support. And then we will, over time, release technical corrections. The technical corrections do not break any existing implementations. So sometimes, and that's very careful language. But we make changes that might break some implementations, but we actually check to see that there were none. So for instance, in the technical correction for release 4 we just published, we changed some URLs for code systems. but we did quite a lot of research to check that that wasn't actually going to break anybody. So we do that work. What that means is if you implement 4.0.0, you're going to be conforming against 4.0.1. But typically, we're patching the supporting infrastructure, clarifying words, fixing broken inconsistencies. We're very limited in what we'll do in a patch. Otherwise, it'll be pushed on to the next version. So those are the major milestones. As I said, no one is still supporting DS2.1 that I know about. If you in the room know that someone is, come and tell me later. Now, there is an actual JSON file which is published for all the specifications that HL7 or the FHIR Foundation publish. There's a JSON file at the URL of the implementation guide or the core specification and package-list.json. So you can write code that knows about all the versions. It's documented on our wiki, Confluence, and you can all of my tools hang off this, all my publication tooling, so this is reliable. If you want to iterate this programmatically, you can do that. All right, so versioning is expensive. Sometimes I joke that if you look up IT in the dictionary, you find versioning is expensive. And historically in healthcare, version changes, like from between different versions of HL7 version 2, have been extremely expensive for care providers and quite profitable for vendors, and in ways that just don't make sense. So we tried to get away from versioning, and in the end, when FHIR goes normative, you won't need to worry about versions. But that will be a very, very long time away. More and more content will move through to normative, but we keep adding new content. And the new content that we're adding now, the guideline-based work, the evidence-based medicine, cohort management, which is coming, these are things we have no experience in interoperating on at all. No one's ever done that before. So one kind of thing to talk about a maturity process for lab reports. We've been interoperating with lab reports for 40 years, right? It's just nailing down the last details, introducing REST, easy compared to some of these other things. They're decades away from going normative, based on my experience of interop. So it's going to be with us for a long time. It took us a while to accept that that was the case. So when it comes to supporting multiple versions, there's several subjects we can talk about. One is converting between versions. Another is around what your API strategy could be. Then we can talk about persistence, and we talk about all these and documentation. So it's basically work through those. The first thing to do is to talk about converting between versions. So both Release 3 and Release 4 include, for every structural artifact, a summary of differences. These are generated programmatically, and then I go through and improve them manually. So it's about 3 or 4 weeks' work as we come up to a full release. And it tells you from human to human what has changed. You can't process this, although it is published as a JSON file. So you can try and process it, but in the end, it comes back to you need to read that and understand it. How many people have actually used those? A few heads. So it's one of the ways of displaying a resource. I encourage you, if you are doing this, to look at that. Then we also publish a transform written in FHIR mapping language. So there's a tutorial about FHIR mapping language later today. 2 tutorials, I think. And we, some of the developers at FHIR, who I can't see in the room right now, and myself wrote all these transforms. And then what we do is we take all of the examples that were published with Release 3, and we run them through the transforms that we wrote to transform from Release 3 to Release 4. We validate the output against Release 4, and then we transform them back and check to see if they round-tripped without any change. Now, and then that's the table that I publish in the specification that tells you the resource, the number of examples, whether they actually executed okay or not, whether they round-tripped without any change, and whether they were valid against Release 4. Now, I don't try and take Release 4 resources and convert them back to Release 3. We only start with the Release 3 resources and go forwards and backwards. And you'll see that some of them don't round trip at all, and some of them don't round trip reliably. And that's because when we make the changes from version to version, sometimes we just change what we were thinking. And you can't transform without a deeper context about the data. And so you should treat these maps as a starting point. And people are welcome to use these maps either as documentation, very accurate documentation, or machine executable transforms from release 2 to release 3 and release 3 to release 4, and I will publish them again, release 4 to release 5. Then there's a set of classes in Java in the happy library to convert between the resources. These, you just load up the class and do the conversion. I maintain these for the conformance resources. I stand behind these for the conformance resources. They are correct. Actually, they're not, but they will be by the end of the year. But we use those routinely day in, day out, those conversions inside all of the publication and the validation tooling. And we are committed to them for the conformance resources. That means concept map, code system, value set, structure definition, search parameter, operation definition, implementation, that set of resources. We are committed to those conversions. And you can see that we can convert interconvert between multiple versions, including technically unsupported versions. But when it comes to other resources, maintaining these is a nightmare. I probably 5% of the time that we spend preparing a new version of the time that I spend preparing a new version is maintaining these classes. And I don't, the way the process works, I have to keep them compiling. So I don't get a lot of time to do it. Like someone will say, can you update the code so we can test something? That means I have to rewrite these conversions. And sometimes I look at it and go, hell, it's just too hard. I can't be bothered, and I'll just comment the conversion out. So a bunch of commented code in here, a bunch of unreliable code in here because we haven't tested it. But there is code in here that other people have contributed because they're using in production. So you're welcome to use it, but buyer beware, basically. Beware, test well. We take contributions. There are people who maintain specific conversions in here. All right. Now you can, in your implementation, say, okay, well, I can do it with multiple versions, and I don't want to convert. What I'll basically do is write some kind of interface facade, which I've got pseudocode here for. They'll just do it on the fly for me. So I'll say, we've got patient, release 2, release 3, release 4. I'm going to have an iPatient, which is the same for all of them. And I don't care which one I'm dealing with underneath. I'm just going to deal with my iPatient facade. And then I've got like an R3 patient that figures out how to actually implement R3, my view of patient for R3. And most of the reference implementations have some amount of this. What it is an immense amount of work to maintain that. So we have some in Happy, and I got some in my server. So my server is a common terminology engine core that runs against an I code system and an I value set. We take contributions to that code in the reference implementations as well, but it's not actually that conceptually difficult. It's just lots and lots of work to maintain it, and then to decide when you get to a new version that you need to change your version independent view of the patient because of, or whatever resource it is, because of something that happened in the underlying version. But lots of people do something like this for their limited use cases. All right. Now let's move away from conversion between formats, talk about the API. First thing I want to be clear about is when you talk about an API exchange, the converting between the resource versions is not all that changes. The actual name of the resource changes, the search parameters change, the content type changed between 2 and 3. We won't be changing it again. It's normative now. And so what that means is the actual exchange has the version, not just the resources. So the simplest approach is to say, okay, I'm going to put multiple endpoints. For instance, test.fire.org has /R2, /R3, and /R4. And if you go and hit that and get the capability statement will tell you which version is in use on each of those endpoints. So this is a nice, simple approach that everybody can get their heads around, and that's really nice. But the problem with this is that if you have multiple if you have on test.fire.org, each of those endpoints is a different set of data, right? There's no relationship. There's only occasional coincidental relationship between the different endpoints. But if you are facading on those endpoints onto a common underlying database, that means is that your single record now has multiple URLs that it appears under, and that creates versioning and management caching conflicts for the same content. And so one logical record with multiple different URLs, that creates challenges. And so people have said, maybe there's a better way than having multiple endpoints. So it's now possible to have a single endpoint with multiple versions that supports multiple version. So what you do is on the application /FHIR plus JSON media type, on the accept or the content type, you specify the version, and that'll be the version of the exchange. So I don't think it's up at the moment, but at test.fire.org /RX can support either 2 or 3 or 4. In my hack implementation, which is something I'm still working on, there are actually different underlying data, that's bad, right? You would not do that in a production system. I'm working on that. But if you did, then this can be whichever version you want. And the client specifies the version, but the client can ask for an endpoint, what versions do you support? And it can get back a list of the versions that the endpoint supports. This endpoint supports 3 and 4, and if you don't specify, it'll default to 4. And then the client can say, well, I can do 3, so I'll do 3. I'll just specify each exchange that it's 3. And that way you can have a single endpoint that can support multiple versions. And if you just ask for a plain JSON back, you get back a much simpler form. And some of the servers are starting to support this endpoint, the /versions, $versions endpoint. So the server specifies the version it supports. The client chooses the version, and that fixes the whole exchange. You can't mix between versions in exchange, except in one case, which I'll talk about shortly. We've published concept maps to convert between resource names and search parameters across versions, and they're published here. I did that work earlier this year. This is funny because everyone was hammering me to do it, so I finally got time to do it. And then I published it, and no one's ever commented on it or criticized it. I don't know what that means. Maybe I just magically got it right first time with no issues. I don't believe in that. So, but again, review is required. You can also there's an API to ask a server to convert between versions. So this is a special case. So you post content to $convert, and you say that you've got the content in version 3 and you want the server to convert it to version 4. You, of course, are asking the server to do that. That doesn't mean the server can, although James and I are going to find time at some stage to move all of the other infrastructure that I've already talked about into Happy and make it available on the convert endpoint so that any Happy server can do whatever is best practice. I don't know of any other servers that do this right now, but we're working on it. Now, if you're not exchanging content with a RESTful API, and lots of people don't, there's almost always the MIME type. You should have a MIME type in scope, and so you would specify the version in the MIME type outside the resource. But it is sometimes For instance, if you're just storing a file, there's no MIME type. And so it is possible to actually mark inside the resource, in the meta profile of the resource, any resource, say that this resource conforms to version 4 patient. It's quite possible, especially once you go normative, that a resource will conform to multiple different versions. So you could see multiple different versions written in here. For instance, the change from 3 to 4 for patient was pretty small. So if you didn't use any of those features that changed, you could have a single patient that conformed to both 3 and 4. We encourage you not to get to this point. This is painful for lots of reasons downstream, so it's much better to just use the MIME type if you can. All right, persisting resources. So you need to store resources wherever you store them, however you store them. You need to know what the version they are. Sometimes you just know this entire store has a single version. Sometimes you've got mixed versions, so you need to track that. You can't not know. If you really have to, you can use that profile marker I just talked about. Now imagine you're designing an actual system, and so now we move out of the scope of the interface and into implementation advice. You kind of got generally 3 options. You can store resources as you get them, and if you want them in a particular version, you can convert them on the fly. Or you can store resources in the version you want, and then you can convert them to some other version if you need them for some reason. Of course, if you actually have a relational database or something else that's not FHIR in the back end, you're just writing conversion routines, this question doesn't come up because you just got some other form that you use. Or increasingly what I'm seeing is people doing all 3 at once. So the first thing you do with every resource you ever see is store it in an audit trail as you received it, in the version you received it. The second thing you do is you say, well, I'll convert them to my preferred version that I do analysis on as my mainstream version. Assumes that you have one, but most people do. And then you pull off specific data out of those resources into relational databases or something for particular indexing purposes. Now we can spend hours talking about this, and the question behind this is one of the most frequently asked questions that we have that implementers start with. So I'm not going to go any further into that. We could, but we won't. And then we get to documentation strategy, and this is an emerging thing for us, is that we're now starting to produce implementation guides. We want to provide the same implementation guidance to communities running on multiple different versions because they're stuck for other reasons, multiple different versions. So in the States, the Da Vinci implementation guides, we have several of those that cover multiple versions. And you can set out and say, well, I'm just going to write 2 sets of documentation. That's really simple. I've got a set of documentation for release 3 and a set of documentation for release 4. And then if you just pick the one that you're working with and you read that. And that's really good if you're only working with one version. But if you're working with both versions, and quite a lot of people do, you have to read them all twice, everything twice. And then it turns out the editor made a change in one and forgot to change it in the other. It's turning out to be very difficult. Or you can go for a complex approach, which some of the Da Vinci guides have done. We have one set of documentation just with different profiles and different examples, but all the same value sets and all the same narrative around how things work. And the implementers explicitly know that they're dealing with multiple versions all the time. How many people have tried to read and implement those Da Vinci guides? Yeah, not many people have done that, and it's tricky. So we're still working on making that better. And then it gets worse if you start saying that our business rules differ between versions, which I highly recommend that you don't get there, but people do. All right, so versions are expensive and painful, and we have no magic bullet to change that. We just have a set of tools that you can use. You should think of them as different kinds of hammer, which you are welcome to hit yourself in the head with. There's some kind of fantasy land where multiple versions don't happen, but we don't live in that fantasy land. And I'm happy to take questions about versioning now, and I'm sure there'll be lots. Hey, Alexander, you're first. Um, you should avoid using it if you possibly can. You should avoid relying on it if you can possibly can. Our experience is that you should avoid using meta.profile wherever you can avoid it. And I can't say this strongly enough. Tool writers go, hey, I'll just use that and I'll make everyone else use that, validator authors or whatever. Don't do that, because it's got all this downstream price with people arguing about resources can say that or they don't say that, and it's irrelevant to everybody else but some few guys in the middle who didn't care about the cost for everybody else. And national programs, well, I love to do that. You've got to say the version. Why? Because you just do. As much as possible, hammer this to the community. Stay away from using meta.profile. It's a rope that you can hang yourself with. If you have to use it, you have to use it. But if you can possibly avoid using it, do that. And particularly for versions as well. It's the same basic issue. We put it in there for a good reason, because there are good reasons to use it. But there's bad reasons to use it too, and lots of people do. All right. Yeah. So the different methods we have, one of the reasons we chose, where was it? I passed it. Where was it? One of the reasons we chose the meta profile, one of the reasons we chose this is because you can put it in previous versions. It's version independent, this choice. And also this one as well works with previous versions. We just didn't specify it because we didn't know about it. Yeah, well, basically seamlessly works backwards. And so we just covered it backwards, basically, right? So you can have an endpoint that speaks version release 2, uses that parameter. That just works. You won't find it written down in the release 2 specification, but that's what we're doing. Yeah, that's right. Mark. Yeah. Right, well then you couldn't rightfully do that. Everything's going to become stable eventually. I mean, a value set or a code system changing is a structural change to the resource, and so that counts. And so you can only claim support of multiple versions if the resource validates against if the resource works against those claims. I'll be clear to everybody about this. This is a claim. Anybody can make that claim. It doesn't make it true, right? But you can test the truth of the claim. It's just slow to test the truth of the claim. So just be aware, if you are using meta profile, it's just a claim. I don't want to get into the deep and difficult subject of managing value sets, but there is plenty of policy around that, and there's plenty of committee work on that. That's all I'll say on that. Sorry, but it's a long discussion. Jeff? And the issues, I mean, we add new fields in release 4. There's a extension formalism, so you can use R4 content in R3 and just use an R4 extension URL. The validator doesn't do that. I haven't done that in the validator yet, but it's on my list of things to do this year. The hardest things are actually, because you can just use extensions if you need to, but the hardest things are what Mark was talking about, where you've actually the coding has changed, and you're looking at the codes from here to there and going, they're just not compatible, right? The committee's changed the way it's thinking about the requirements that underlie the resource, and or sometimes we've moved stuff between resources. Well, here's a great one. In release 4, we collapsed diagnostic service request and referral request into service request. I can easily convert from referral request to service request from release 3 to release 4, but when I'm looking at a release 4 resource, it may have an extension that says this was a referral request in release 3, but most of them won't. And how do I decide whether it's a deep terminology question as to whether this should be a referral request or a service request? Most of the issues in terms of going backwards, but those same issues happen going forwards as well because we change our analysis. We're not so prone to splitting resources up. We've done it once with value set and code system becoming a value set and code system, which is another whole nightmare for version conversion. Those are the kind of issues that you run into. May. So the 4.0 release was 4.0.1 release, which was 3 weeks ago now, was the most difficult technical correction I've ever done, because as part of that we agreed through the early part of this year to make some breaking changes to the tooling infrastructure. And we knew that when we made those breaking changes, everything would break. And we agreed that the least worst time to make those changes was when we did the technical correction. Then it turned into an enormous saga to get the technical correction finalized and then done. And because we did the tooling changes as well as the technical correction at the same time, it could have been much worse. But that is by far, we will not be resetting the tooling infrastructure like that again. It's 2 months of my time doing all this stuff. It's not going to happen again. And it's all packaging stuff. And if you're interested in packaging which drives the tooling, then there's a packaging session, I think it's tomorrow. And so that's why it was bad. Not because of the technical correction or the FHIR versioning stuff, but because we conflated the tooling reset with the technical correction. The validator is all sweet. The validator will validate. As far as I can tell, it does what anybody's ever told me they think it should do in regard to versioning. If you say that you're validating against 4.0.0, it will actually validate against 4.0.1 because the 4.0.0 validation is broken. That's why we did the technical correction, but it doesn't make any difference to you. It just handles that all magically. The IG publisher, on the other hand, I said you have to say what you're doing, but that was a choice that I made. But really, it was about the tooling reset, the package reset. That was the big pain. Alexander. Yep. Yep, we do. We do. So here's the FHIR spec. That's my build of it. On the version management policy page, I see it doesn't get a Guernsey at the top of the page, but there's a section called Extensions for Converting Between Resources. which documents how you would use a release 5 element in a release 2 resource. You can't always pull that off because there's stuff inside the data types, but mostly it just works. What I haven't done is train the validator on this stuff yet. It's on my list of things to do this year. But at the moment, the validator will see that and go, oh, I can't find the definition, and it's in the HL7 space, so it clearly means you've done something wrong. But I've got to fix that up. But this is all, it's all documented here, and this is the release 4 specification. That's another thing where the release 4 thing applied retrospectively. Yeah. Well, how are you sending them together? But what format are you using? Yeah. So I think you mean you're putting them both in the same bundle. So I should be clear about that. And this has come up several times. You can bundle itself has a version. So release 3 or release 4 artifact. We have no support for mixing versions in a bundle because a bundle has a version. And the reference implementations will never go there. And the reference implementations will go, the bundle is an R3 resource, every resource in the bundle is an R3 resource. So if you are mixing different versions of resource into one bundle, you should expect to get some pain, significant pain at some stage. If you want to have a single package that includes multiple versions of resources, that means you need to actually do that outside the bundle. And that's where you should have the MIME type. So you'd have multiple, like a zip package with, or a MIME package, where you specify the MIME type with the version for the resources, and that's what we always recommend, that you should find somewhere to have a MIME type that says you should read these resources with version 2 or version release 3 or release 4. So you already know what version you're having before you start reading with a reference implementation or whatever it is with your code. Does that make sense? Okay, all right, let's see if I got the right. So let's hack this then. So you've got your own patient resource, your own patient profile here, which you referred to here. And then if you want to specify different versions, you can say it's version 1.0.0. This is documented in the specification where you put a vertical bar and then the version after that. So you can specify which version you're talking about. That's even more pain. So you should try not to do that. But if you have to do that, then that's how you do that. I think that one was in R3. I think. But you can do that anyway. That's just, and it will be supported by our tooling, but I don't know who else will support it. But I think we did that. There might have been $, and there might have been question ver equals as a syntax. I don't remember when we made those changes. One more question I have time for. Yeah. Hang on, I've only got a minute. Probably no time for a question from you.
We can take it off.
No, you can ask. Go on. Yeah.
Okay,
It'll just be hard, won't it?
So you said using meta profile in your resources was more than enough rope climbing.
Yep.
And you said that staying with profile to solve a claim.
Yep.
So that's from, let's say that the claim comes from the client side of the country.
Yeah.
If you actually validate it when you receive it as a server side, it's no longer a claim. Or you could say it's a verified claim.
Yep.
How is that then possible afterwards if you have actually validated and stating this resource actually conforms to this profile? Because you said don't use it because
Didn't say not to use it because it's a claim. I just said to remember that it's a claim. The client may claim, but the client could validate it too. But you should always treat it as a claim. But the reason not to use it is because of where it leads you downstream, where people start doing processing depend on it, profiles start specifying that the profile has to say this. It makes reuse really difficult because you've got one general structure that works on all these different places, but all of them say, but you have to mark it to say it's our place. And so then you end up with one implementation and a whole pile of variations just to mark it with a particular profile. If you wanna go into this in detail, we'll do it in some BOF somewhere, somewhere. It is, but we have lots of experience of getting yourself tied in knots with this space. And so that's why our general advice is don't use it unless you really have to.
that goes for both client and server side.
Yeah, it's not about client and server. It's about information processing and obligations and how you think about managing it. And believe me, I've sat in multiple national programs where they've gone, we need to be in control. And I'm like, have you counted the cost? Well, it's not our cost. That's where national programs go wrong, that kind of thing. All right, I've run out of time. Thank you very much.